In our first story, Behind Mansion Walls, a clash of classes
What's a painter doing with a BMW?
becomes a fight to the death.
The hammer, the tools were right there at his disposal.
And later,
Really, she vanished into thin air.
the day the music died.
He could be violent, and he could be charming, he'd be loving, and he could be controlling.
You're not going anywhere.
I'm Christopher Mason. Being born into a large family fortune should be a great blessing, but the silver spoon is often dipped in poison. Greed can turn a glorious birthright into a noose around your neck. Behind mansion walls, these pedigreed offspring are cursed with a toxic inheritance.
New Year's Eve in New York. While America welcomes in 1994, a child wakes to a nightmare.
It had been a very violent scene. Plenty of blood. Floor, bed, walls, and the window. It was in the room everywhere.
A scene like this might not be unusual if it was somewhere in the Bronx, but this is Bronxville, where crimes like this just don't happen.
Absolute shock. You just don't see murders in Bronxville. You didn't hear about families' dirty laundry in public there, and you certainly didn't hear about, domestic violence, and you never heard about murder in the town.
A short train ride north from Grand Central Station, and you're immersed in the old world charm of Bronxville, New York. For the city's brokers and corporate kings, Bronxville is a leafy haven from the madness of Manhattan.
It's 1 square mile. It's a very wealthy suburb.
There's a lot of money there. A lot of chief executives live up there.
Not just chief executives. JFK once owned a home here. In fact, Bronxville is awash with old money. All the more shocking, then, that the victim of this crime is one of their own. An heiress with a famous name, Anne Scripps Douglas.
Anne is a true blue blood. Her great-great-grandfather James forged the legendary Scripps media empire. The pretty young heiress grew up in a privileged world of debutante balls, finishing schools, and society galas.
She was a good-looking woman, physically beautiful, and she was sweet as can be.
She came from this pedigree, and she hung around some of the country clubs and cocktail parties, so she was very much part of the wealthy social world of Bronxville.
Anne has her sights set on one glittering prize, a suitable husband. She's grooming herself to be the perfect wife and mother. And the fairy tale comes true when she marries successful stockbroker Anthony Morel.
Hey, honey.
Oh, hi, honey.
She was an heiress. She had a trust fund of her own.
How's your day?
She had the normal upper-class life. Married well, lived in Bronxville, a very wealthy suburb, had 2 beautiful daughters.
Anne loves her domestic life, and while Anthony spends more and more time away from home,
I gotta go.
Thank you.
she plays dedicated mom to Alexandra and Annie.
She was just the loveliest lady. I mean, she really devoted herself around the clock to those kids.
Her picture-perfect world is shattered when Wall Street wild boy Anthony files for divorce. In a matter of months, the heiress is hooked up with a man a few rungs lower on the social ladder.
Scott Douglas was a painter, carpenter, handyman. He had come from a middle-class family, wasn't a man of means at all.
They started dating. She apparently fell in love, and he fell in love.
Her social status might have dropped a notch or three, but the couple is happy. After a short courtship, Anne marries her handsome handyman.
I'll drink to that.
Shortly after the marriage, Anne became pregnant, gave birth to Tori.
Their new daughter is showered with love and attention. And Anne's domestic dream is rebuilt until the last few hours of 1993. At 10 p.m., Anne's daughter Annie leaves for a New Year's Eve party. When she returns home after midnight, she finds the house silent, the front door locked.
When Annie arrived home and she called the police to break in.
Upstairs, a gruesome discovery awaits.
It's my mother! It's my mother! Get out of my way! She's my mother!
I saw the scene. It was just a violent, awful scene.
For Bronxville attorney John Q. Kelly, the memories of that day still resonate.
I live in the area, and someone had even mentioned that they saw a crime scene tape around the residence late that night, early morning, you know, but nobody really knew what had happened. And I found out later that day that Anne had been bludgeoned.
Kelly is later engaged by Anne's daughters as their legal counsel.
I knew the daughters personally, knew how lovely they were, knew how close Anne was to her daughters and her daughters to Anne, and I also knew the daughters had gone through a hard time, both with the divorce from their father, Anne's husband, who they, you know, love very much, and Anne's subsequent marriage to someone they disliked very much.
Anne's alive, but just barely. Her husband Scott has disappeared.
The story was a sensation in the New York City area. It was somewhat salacious. It had the elements of death, murder, intrigue, a whodunit, where was Scott?
Police also delve into the question of who Scott was. And they discover the fun-loving handyman had a darker side.
Douglas had a little bit of a checkered background, some indication he might have been fooling around with drugs. He had a child out of wedlock that he never told his wife about.
When Scott meets Anne Scripps, many believe it's not just her beauty that attracts him.
Scott married Anne probably for money. And he saw her as, I hate to use the term, as a cash cow.
And it seems Scott tried to milk her for all she was worth. The high school dropout shows off the spoils of his newfound fortune: drinking, womanizing, living life in the fast lane.
He enjoyed a lot of the comforts of coming from wealth. Suddenly he was driving a BMW, you know, an expensive BMW, and he'd pull into a paint store, and the guy at the store would say to him, "What's a painter doing with a BMW?"
While he joyrides around town, Scott's painting gigs have dried up. He's sponging more and more from his wife. The cracks in their marriage begin to show.
She was supporting him. She wasn't used to that. It wasn't in her upbringing or lifestyle to do that. Anne was fed up with him not being employed, not having an income. And Scott was frustrated that Anne was disappointed in him, and he wasn't accepted by Anne's family or friends.
Very soon it became evident that this was indeed a mismatch. He really did not fit into her world of country clubs, and he resented it.
Here we go.
Anne's daughters saw through Scott's charming facade right from the start.
They made no secret of the fact they didn't like him. They made no secret of the fact they didn't want her married.
That's the way to go.
They were totally opposed to it. Didn't like the way he treated their mother. Didn't like the fact that he was unemployed and basically a scoundrel that was living off Anne. They could see it, and just were already encouraging her, from my understanding, is to divorce him, get rid of him, kick him out.
The honeymoon is over. In 1993, Anne begins divorce proceedings.
This was the ultimate rejection, and he had threatened to take the child and disappear off the face of the earth, as he put it.
Police have been called to their house on several occasions for incidents of domestic violence. It comes to the point where Anne had actually gone into family court seeking an order of protection against Scott to get him out of the house.
The order of protection stops Scott from taking their daughter Tori, but allows him to stay in the house.
The tensions and the discontent were reaching a boiling point.
Those emotions boil over on the afternoon of New Year's Eve.
Anne received a phone call from her ex-husband.
Tony, the ex-husband, had talked to Scott and sort of told him what he thought of Scott and what others thought of Scott, too.
You don't call here again.
And apparently this drove Scott Douglas into a fury.
As night falls, Scott's anger and his drinking escalate. Anne's daughter fears for her mom's safety.
One of the daughters told her mother, look, I'm not going to go out because I'm worried about Scott. He seems very angry at you, and I'm worried he's going to hurt you.
She didn't want to go out. Ian encouraged her to go to a party and had told Ian that she'd be fine, not to worry about her.
Somewhere to be dressed like that. Jesus. Huh?
Anne never believed he would hurt her physically.
A few short hours later, Anne is found lying in a blood-stained bed. She's now on life support, unable to tell cops who attacked her. But there's a clue. Scott's car has been found abandoned on a nearby bridge. Engine still running. The driver, nowhere to be seen. Could he have jumped from the bridge in despair over what he had just done?
There was a fair amount of traffic that night on New Year's Eve. Remarkably, no one had seen him actually get out of his car and jump. It was possible he was still alive and out there somewhere.
The early hours of New Year's Day, 1994. On the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York. Police search the car of Scott Douglas and make a grisly discovery. A claw hammer covered in blood. The weapon used to savagely bash Scott's wife, heiress Anne Scrapes Douglas. Did he attack Anne in a moment of fury, then later regret his crime?
It's very high off the water. You're talking about quite a jump. The river was clearly frozen or filled with chunks of ice, and jump from that height, you really had to be desperate.
For 5 days, police scour the icy Hudson and fail to find any sign of Scott Douglas. But a recent purchase could hold a clue to his whereabouts.
He'd bought hundreds of dollars of camping equipment, and they believed that he took that with him as he made his escape.
Investigators start to wonder if this is all an elaborate hoax. Scott could have faked his own death and might now be hiding somewhere in the woods.
Anne's family actually believed that he'd left the BMW with the engine running on the bridge to make it seem as if he'd jumped.
The only question was whether he'd actually jumped off the Tappan Zee Bridge or staged it and got off the bridge somehow and was still at large.
There's a third possibility. Anne's ex-husband, Anthony Morrell, is back on the scene. He contacted her just hours before the bashing. Could Anthony have attacked them both, then framed Scott Douglas for the crime. Anthony's not acting like a guilty man. Stricken with grief, he holds a vigil at his ex-wife's bedside. He knows what it feels like to be dying. He's terminally ill with liver disease.
And the only thing that was going to save him was a liver transplant.
Anne's daughters must make a heart-wrenching choice.
Their mother was still alive, but, you know, they knew she was brain dead. They knew their father was dying of liver cirrhosis.
6 days after the attack, the daughters of Anne Scripps Douglas extinguish one life to save another. They donate their mother's liver to their father.
Painful as it was, they still loved their father, and anything they could do to, you know, give life to one of their parents, they wanted to do.
Meanwhile, Scott Douglas's brother Todd delivers some damning evidence. Soon after Anne was attacked, Scott made a phone call.
And he stopped at a gas station and called his brother Todd and said, "I've done something really bad this time."
Todd's not home to take the call. He receives the message hours later. Police investigating the attack on Anne discover that Scott Douglas kept plenty of secrets from his wife.
He was telling her all kinds of lies about his background. He told her, for example, that he was Jewish, that his parents were Jewish. It's apparently not true at all.
He also kept a separate bachelor pad, where his female neighbors didn't know he had a wife.
Everyone said she was very guileless, very innocent, and trusting. That was the word people used about her. In their minds, it explained why she would form a relationship with a guy like Scott Douglas.
Convinced of Scott's guilt, the Scripps family posts a $25,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. But he's still missing and could now be gunning for the girls.
They were in deathly fear of their mother's husband, who they knew was a murderer at this point, and didn't know whether he was dead or alive.
Spring in New York is a joyous time. With cherry trees in blossom, squirrels emerge from hibernation, and the first invitations of the social season arrive in the mail. As the residents of Bronxville dust off their ball gowns and tuxedos, something else bursts forth from the warming waters of the Hudson: the bloated corpse of Scott Douglas.
Trains go along the river, and a Metro-North Railroad man saw the body easily 20 miles south of the Tappan Zee Bridge.
In April, he was found on the bank of the river, way downstream where he would have drifted after the jumping.
The time of death is easy to determine. Scott's fancy gold watch stopped when he plunged into the Hudson's icy waters on New Year's Eve, right at the stroke of midnight.
It was ruled a suicide, and a scary, violent, dreary one at that.
Three months after the brutal murder, investigators can finally piece together what happened to Anne Scripps Douglas.
He'd been drinking excessively that night. There was also the phone call from Tony that triggered things too. Anne was clearly afraid of Scott.
What have I told you? What have I told you, huh?
When she went to bed that night, she locked herself in Annie's room to be protected from him. She was afraid to be around him.
Enraged by Anne's threats of divorce and spurred on by alcohol, the builder turns to the tools of his trade.
The hammer, the tools were right there at his disposal. He apparently kicked in the door where Anne was sleeping.
Sometime before the clock struck midnight, he hit Anne repeatedly with his claw hammer.
In the next room is Scott and Anne's 3-year-old daughter, Tori.
It had been a very violent scene, as you can imagine, with the multiple blows to the head with a steel-clawed hammer by a healthy, strong man.
Scott flees the scene of the crime. But on the Tappan Zee Bridge, remorse overwhelms him as New Year's Eve approaches. Tori never speaks of what happened that night. The orphan toddler is adopted and raised by relatives.
Tori needed to relocate, start over without this horrendous past haunting her.
Now 21, Tori has been arrested several times on drug-related charges.
None of the daughters recovered from the pain, the terror, the just brutality of what had taken place. No one could recover from something like that.
And the tale has a final tragic twist. "15 years after she discovered her mother's battered body, Annie leaps to her own death in a hauntingly familiar setting.
Annie, the younger of the two daughters, took her own life on the same bridge, the Tappan Zee Bridge.
No one understands why she chose to mimic her stepfather. Maybe the message was, this is what ruined my life.
If Anne's ancestor, James Scripps, knew the curse his fortune would bring, perhaps he would never have bequeathed it at all.
I think the sort of Shakespearean end to the whole thing was they were all victims and no one came out of it right again. A true tragedy all the way around.
The bigger a city is, the easier it can be for someone to disappear into it. Home to 10 million people, London, England has no shortage of places to hide. For the living, or for the dead.
Really, she vanished into thin air. Nobody had any idea where she'd gone.
This is the last footage ever captured of 40-year-old Gracia Morton. In the lobby of her luxury apartment building, she checks her reflection in the mirror and steps out into the unknown.
Even if you disappear in the middle of a very busy city like London, in some cases it's just impossible to find out what's happened to you.
In the back seats of their Bentleys and in their oak-paneled drawing rooms, Gracia's neighbors express their horror. If the streets of the royal borough of Chelsea and Kensington aren't safe, then nowhere is.
It's known as the Royal Borough for good reason. Since the 17th century, kings and queens of England have called it home. Just a quarter mile from Gracia's apartment is Kensington Palace, once home to the late Princess Diana. Of course, the People's Princess wasn't the first royal bride to suffer a tragic death. Henry VIII famously dealt with his marital discontent by beheading two of his wives.
Just like the king's ill-fated spouses, Gracia Morton had married into money. And police wonder whether this fact is somehow connected to her disappearance.
She was from Argentina originally, and she was a trained classical violinist. And she came over here to improve her skills and, perhaps make a career of it over here. But then she met Michael Morton through her sister. He was 20 years older than her, and they fell in love and got married, and then had a child.
Debonair English gentleman Michael Morton might be a little old, but age comes with certain benefits.
Michael Morton had a lot of private money he'd invested wisely over the years. Michael Morton could have been considered to be a very wealthy man. Gracia was very attractive, intelligent, classical musician, elegant, and I think liked the idea of being in love. And she was doubtless bowled over by this older man.
When Michael's mother dies, his fortune increases. He inherits more than £1 million and bestows a gift on his wife, £500,000 in her own bank account.
Like it? Yes. You're wearing a beautiful pink dress tonight.
There was a lot of money involved. She had money that he'd given her in a special account.
Then, in early 1997, Gracia files for divorce. She moves into an elegant new apartment and into the arms of a new love.
She bought a large flat. She bought a car. She also spent money on decorating the flat.
It's that very apartment that Gracia's boyfriend says he enters on the morning of November 13th, 1997.
Gracia, darling. Darling, are you here? Gracia, where are you? Gracia?
There was no sign of Gracia. The cat was unfed. Gracia's clothing was still there. We've got to go to the police.
Well, the police obviously had a fairly open mind about the case. All they knew was that this woman had gone missing in broad daylight, no signs of a violent struggle or anything. So they had to consider all eventualities.
And in a city the size of London, there's no shortage of those.
Could have been a random stranger attack. And no doubt there were inquiries about whether there had been any attacks on women in that area of West London. There was a case not long before, about a year before, where a French student had been hitchhiking. She'd been abducted by a lorry driver and murdered.
Gracia might have met with foul play. She might have also disappeared by choice, but she hasn't gone without a trace.
She left her car, her keys, her mobile phone. Does anybody know what's happened to her?
In the shadow of grand old English mansions on a stylish London street, police discover an abandoned car. It belongs to beautiful Argentinian violinist Gracia Morton. She's been missing for 2 days.
It was a fairly ordinary day in November 1997 when Gracia took her daughter to school and everything was quite normal. She didn't say anything particularly special to the child. She just simply dropped her off at school and really she vanished into thin air.
Police find her cell phone and other belongings. But just as intriguing as what's in the car is where it was discovered.
It was obviously rather strange that she left her car outside his home.
The $1 million home of her estranged husband, Michael Morton.
and he was, by his own account, the last person to see her alive.
Morton admits he argued with his estranged wife on the day she disappeared.
I'm not really happy about it.
He said there had been a row between them about their daughter's schooling. He denies that there was any violence.
No, I am not happy about
And I'm listening, but it's my decision, and that is where she is.
He claims she left, bizarrely leaving her car and her car keys with him.
Outside, and I have some things I have to do, so I need you to look after it, okay?
And then she was never seen again. Journalist Chris Summers was reporting for the British media as the case of Gracia's disappearance unfolded. He researched the early stages of her marriage to Michael Morton, a time when there appeared to be no clouds on the horizon.
Initially, they seemed to have this fantastic sort of whirlwind romance. It was maybe to others outside of it slightly strange. She was 29 when she met him, and he was 48. You know, quite an age difference, but they seemed to get on very well together.
Police sift through every nook and cranny of Morton's London home and stumble upon a heartwarming scene. Gracia's devoted husband has set up a shrine to his missing wife.
And they were basically photo frames with some flowers or candles nearby. But what was strange about them is how quickly they appeared after the Gracia disappeared. Whereas she was essentially missing, she could have gone off with her boyfriend or with another man or something. Who knows what had happened to her. But he almost immediately jumps to the conclusion that she's dead.
While Morton seems able to peer into the future, police are looking into his past. They hear he often referred to his wife as a surgically enhanced trophy. And there are rumors he imposed some bizarre conditions on their relationship, warning Gracia, if she displayed any signs of premenstrual moodiness, he would consider himself unmarried.
He was very controlling.
It's time for you to give Celeste her bath.
And when Gracia sort of showed a bit of independence, a bit of unwillingness to go along, she, then eventually wanted to leave him, he was absolutely furious.
Michael can't stand playing second fiddle to another man. He's enraged when Gracia leaves him.
He told a friend, women just can't do that to me. He would happily drop women himself, but he didn't like women to decide a relationship was over.
He could be violent, and he could be charming, he could be loving, and he could be controlling. He was ultimately a very complicated man.
Complicated. And now that he's been abandoned by his wife, increasingly angry.
He had sent a fax to the family's home in Birmingham, where Gracia had gone to get away from him.
His message claims that marriage is indissoluble and forever.
I will not go through the amount of pain. This is not a threat, it's just common sense. Obviously, in hindsight, it was a veiled threat that he was making, that he wouldn't accept being rejected by her.
Police hear that Gracia feels so threatened by Michael Morton, she refuses to tell him her new address. Which begs the question, has she returned to Argentina, changing her name and identity to escape him?
Her British passport was still there, all her clothes were still there, so she had no means, she had no clothing, she had no baggage, suitcases.
And she'd also left behind her beloved daughter.
Gracia loved her completely, and this was the central theme of the case. Would Gracia get up and leave her life behind, and above all, the daughter who was the most important thing in the world to her.
Then, on Morton's computer, police discover a chilling indication of his state of mind.
This was one of many documents which he had written entirely for his own purposes. It was a story of a man who had killed his wife and children through jealousy and rage.
Morton's article is based on a real-life murder case. Prosecutors believe it might be a veiled confession.
And what Morton was doing in this document was to write an intellectual analysis of the case in the sense of understanding why the killer killed his family.
But sympathizing with a killer doesn't make Morton guilty of murder. For 6 years, British police search for Gracia. They find no sign of her. And there's not enough evidence to charge her husband.
He came across as a very cold character. Didn't really show any emotion at all. You know, didn't seem to be upset by her disappearance.
You must have some idea.
None whatsoever.
But Gracia's family wants answers.
Where would she have gone?
They put pressure on
You
police.
must have said something.
No.
And in 2003, Scotland Yard reopens the case. Fresh witnesses come forward. A neighbor describes Morton acting like a zombie outside his home on the very day Gracia disappeared.
Various witnesses saw him carrying a large piece of vegetation and sort of staggering along under the weight of it. Clearly, in hindsight, that could have been her body wrapped up.
Another neighbor sees Morton doing a spot of spring cleaning.
Morton was seen with, I think, a dustpan and brush sweeping out the back of his car on one occasion, but that was the only piece of evidence which may have suggested disposal by him of the body, which clearly he had to do.
But the evidence is all circumstantial.
There wasn't enough evidence. There wasn't any forensic evidence to tie him to her murder. And with no body, it was quite hard for them to categorically prove that he'd killed her.
Then, Big Brother provides a revelation that will change everything.
The police went through reams and reams of hours of CCTV footage from outside her flat.
Caught on video, a mysterious man entering Gracia's building. Could this be the break police have been waiting for?
A classic case of good, old-fashioned police work.
I think that CCTV footage was the clincher.
In London, England, British police sift through hours of security footage from the flat of missing millionairess Gracia Morton. Finally, a detective hits pay dirt.
And he's suddenly come across this footage of Michael Morton letting himself into her flat with her keys the day after she's gone missing.
Seems innocent enough. Michael Morton is, after all, Gracia's husband. But for a woman once bowled over by Morton, Gracia has learned to stand up for herself. And that includes holding on to a few secrets.
She was absolutely paranoid about him finding out where she lived, and she scrupulously told everybody, do not tell him my address.
That was the major turning point which led back to Michael Morton. He had always claimed to the police that he didn't know where she lived, but clearly he did.
What he did there, we can't really be sure, but it's the fact that he never told the police or never told anyone about that visit, and it's very suspicious.
Morton makes another slip-up.
Police also discovered that he had made I think, one or more phone calls to Gracia's flat before letting himself in. And the voicemail message which he had left on her landline was, I always thought, the real giveaway, because it wasn't, Gracia, are you there? The question was, is anybody there? And that's not the question you would ask if you expected Gracia to be there. It was he phoning ahead just to check the coast was clear so he could allow himself in.
Gracia's boyfriend supplies more evidence. This isn't the only time since her disappearance that Morton has secretly entered the apartment.
He arrived, to his horror, to find Gracia's man friend inside the flat.
Gracia, darling, is that you? What are you doing here?
And he had suddenly to make some pretty quick excuses as to what he was doing there.
What are you doing here? Where's Gracia? I don't know. I gotta go. I don't think she'd appreciate you being here. I gotta go.
Morton claims he found the apartment key on Gracia's keyring. He then asked his daughter which street they lived on and guessed which apartment was Gracia's.
This was a case made up of many strands of circumstantial evidence, but one of the key elements was the realization that Morton had allowed himself access to Gracia's flat, uninvited, unwanted by Gracia in life, with the key, which he claimed she had left behind, on the car key fob. But anyone who knew Gracia knew that that is the last thing she would have done.
When police confront Morton with his lies, he refuses to explain himself. In October 2003, Scotland Yard finally thinks they have enough evidence to charge him with murder. They build a picture of what they believe happened to Gracia that day.
She obviously went to his house quite willingly.
And I'm not really happy about it.
Didn't bring anyone with her.
Michael, I don't
There must have been a blazing row.
Almost certainly it was this resentment and anger that she was leaving him and taking his money. That's what boiled over.
Michael, let go of me! Michael!
It may have been a spur-of-the-moment thing. It may have been a crime of passion, just a row that got out of hand, and he struck her or strangled her or whatever. Or he may have planned it. He may have lured her to his house and decided, right, I'm going to get rid of this woman. You know, she's costing me too much money. She's rejected me. I hate her. I'm going to kill her. Without her body, we'll never know exactly how she died.
Michael Morton stands trial for murder at London's Old Bailey in October 2004. He declines to take the stand.
During the trial, he claimed throughout that he was innocent. He came across as quite cagey, like he was playing a very cunning game, that he was basically saying to them, you prove it.
And that game works. The jury fails to reach a verdict. For high-profile Crown prosecutor Brian Altman, cases don't get much tougher than this.
It was disappointing, but inevitably you have a think about whether there's anything you can change, if you can freshen up the case. And I think we did find a couple of avenues and slightly different ways of approach.
In 2005, a retrial begins. New evidence emerges that will shed light on the real Michael Morton.
There was evidence that he had been violent towards her in the past. He'd laughed it off even after her disappearance.
Where do you think you're going?
He had been tape recorded by one of the sisters sometime later, admitting that he had struck Gracia in the course of their relationship.
He'd had hit Gracia several times, including when she was pregnant. So he did have quite a temper on him.
This time, it is enough to convince the jury. Almost 8 years since Gracia's disappearance, her millionaire husband is acquitted of her murder, but found guilty of manslaughter.
Which is basically a killing which doesn't involve any intent. So that could be killing somebody during a row or a momentary loss of control.
The jury did not convict him of murder. The reason for that, I'm convinced, is because the body was never found.
The judge sentenced him to 7 years, but he wouldn't have served the full 7 years.
Now freed, Morton denies Gracia's family the chance to grieve at her grave.
They have been devastated. Devastated that Morton hasn't had the decency and the courage to tell them where Gracia, the woman after all he once loved so deeply that he couldn't let her go, where he has buried her body.
Despite numerous searches of Michael Morton's house, no sign of his wife's body has been found. Many believe she might be buried somewhere near his country estate.
They seem to have come to the conclusion that he dumped her body outside of London and quite possibly near his home in Oxfordshire.
Oxfordshire is a big county. There's forestation around, and it's surprisingly easy to dispose of a body never to be discovered.
Gracia and Michael's daughter is now 19. Her life scarred forever by the day her mom didn't come home.
If I was her, I would say to him, you know, tell me what you did with my mother, and, you know, maybe I'll see you, but I don't ever want to see you unless you are going to, you know, give me a sense of peace.
Where Gracia's remains are, we will never know.
Inheriting family money. It's wealth without the hard work, a legacy often taken for granted. For Anne Scripps Douglas, a proud heritage lured a deadly lover. While Michael Morton couldn't bear to share his gilded birthright. The good fortune of birth was tainted by murder, courtesy of a toxic inheritance. Till next we meet, behind mansion walls, I'm Christopher Mason.